From Wyoming is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm sorry, but this sounds like a racket. I mean, I can just hear that. That's a nice company you have there. It'd be a tragedy if something happened to it. Wow. About 70% of publicly traded equity shares are held by institutional investors rather than individuals. ISS and Glass Lewis control at least 90% of the proxy advisor market, exerting influence over $20 trillion in investor assets. Glass Lewis is owned by 2 Canadian financial institutions and ISS by a German corporation, yet together they dictate votes for most of America's publicly traded companies. Mr. Egan, should foreign-owned businesses hold that kind of power and control over U.S. companies?
Thank you very much for the question. In our opinion, for capital markets to work properly, you need a diversity of views. Perhaps the biggest concern that exists in the market is that it is dysfunctional in the sense that the 2 dominant proxy advisory firms are not independent, that they're using the recommendations and the scores and the ratings on the consulting side to drive their proxy advisory votes. If they charge nothing for their proxy advisory services and basically using a monopoly on one area, that is with the platforms, to extend to the other area, they would be just fine. So there's relatively little competition because there's blockage, and those 4 items that I had mentioned really should be examined to keep the markets competitive.
Well, do you think that most Americans know about this foreign ownership or what these companies actually do?
I highly doubt it.
Okay, Mr. Crane, with this much control, there must be an understanding of whether proxy advice actually aligns with investor preferences as these firms grow in power and influence. In your experience in working with U.S. manufacturers, have these ideology-driven directives based in climate change policies, the DEI agenda, ESG policies, and more strengthened their competitiveness or added unnecessary costs and constraints?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman, excuse me. I think that the key thing to remember here is that the proxy advisory firms don't have a fiduciary duty to the underlying Main Street investors who are saving for a secure retirement via these larger institutional investors. So when they're making these voting recommendations and casting investors' votes through their robo-voting services on their behalf, they have no underlying obligation to those everyday Americans, whether that's on everyday corporate governance topics or on some of the ESG matters that you've described. They have their own set of beliefs about how corporate America should be run, and they don't have any obligation to align those beliefs with the financial needs of everyday Americans saving for retirement in the public market.
Well, that, in listening to the testimony from the 4 of you, that is the thing that struck me the most, is that this seems to be a fundamental violation of these companies' fiduciary responsibilities to maximize profits for their shareholders. Do you agree with that, Mr. Crane?
I do, and that's a question that's been raised at the SEC, in fact, of whether and to what extent the institutional investors who blindly follow these proxy firm recommendations or indeed allow votes to be robo-vote without even reviewing what the proxy firms are suggesting, whether and to what extent they're complying with their fiduciary obligations as managing assets on behalf of everyday Americans saving for retirement.
Mr. Griffin, I'd like to turn to you. If proxy advisors are making recommendations to asset managers who vote with other people's money, and these recommendations are politically driven, then is the system actually protecting the interests of the real owners, such as the retirees and savers, or is it really furthering the agenda of these other organizations?
Thank you for the question. I think there is a risk that we prioritize different interests than those of the true investors, those individuals who are working people, teachers, firefighters, saving for their retirement, and those interests may diverge from the intermediaries who hire the proxy advisory firms. So I think that's a real risk.
Has the market share of ISS and Glass Lewis allowed for this shift from protection of real investor interest to what seems to be a more politically driven agenda, Mr. Griffin?
That's certainly possible. I think that the market concentration and market power that they have has created, essentially put them in a quasi-regulatory role in some ways, allowing them to determine things like financial materiality standards, standards for director independence, and effective voting thresholds for board response to shareholder proposals. So,
Well, thank you, gentlemen, and Ms. Minow for being here today. I ask a unanimous consent to introduce into the record a document entitled The Conflicted Role of Proxy Advisors from May 2018.
Without objection,